right? What does it mean to be a woman? How do you do womanhood? How do we identify who is deserving of acknowledgement in Women's History Month? And what is there to celebrate, really, right? Well, let's talk about it. First, I want to start by acknowledging that today I come before you as a humble student of my own womanhood, with an offering for you to continue imagining with me and so many other women who don't owe anyone an explanation for our being. I want to remind every woman under the sound of my voice that your worthiness to take up space, to be heard, seen, and felt is unquestionable. I want you to despite this world's ignorance on how to love, that you deserve to be alive. So as we navigate how, when, and why we celebrate women of all kinds, I challenge every person who embodies the prestigious experience of womanhood to remember that no matter who believes, everything you are is changing the world daily, and everything we need is in you. So let's begin, shall we? So I will ask again, what makes a woman a woman? I like to think there are many ways to answer this question, but for the sake of accountability, I want to break this down in a way that's accessible even to those still learning to imagine. There are a few very specific views of womanhood being navigated by the greater world that I want to unpack today. Womanhood inside patriarchy, nuanced womanhoods for people, queer, trans, and the objective reality of all women. I make these distinctions because though each of us are living our own experience, we're also grappling with how to balance how we're perceived, who we actually are, and why we matter. Historically, patriarchy has had a stronghold on what it means to be a woman. So much of the world revolves around what men think, desire, and approve of. My personal response to that has always been, that ain't really my business what men think. But I do understand the complexity of having love, even desire for things and people who don't always acknowledge our best interests. It's part of being human. Not to mention the fact that because sexuality isn't a choice, none of us can actually control who we're attracted to. We can only limit attraction's possibilities as a consequence of our. Being human is also what keeps us believing that things and people can be transformed. That's what women do. The biggest problem with patriarchy is it isn't satisfiable. It does not compromise. There's no room for complexity, nuance, or imagination if it means men are moved from the center of attention. We will humanize them even when they don't humanize us, because we know what it's like to be discarded in the world, right? To feel powerless. Under patriarchy, being a woman comes with so many limitations that instead of expanding with our evolution, we've learned to police one another's womanhoods, to weed out those who won't assimilate to narratives that glorify what men have socialized us to believe is, quote, normal. This is where I cue queer, trans, and non-binary women. Queering womanhood seems to be the greatest crime of the century. Not because it's some new phenomenon existed or that women aren't complex beings, but because men never wanted to see it as a visible freedom and socialized us to follow suit. Women have embodied different sexualities, gender expressions, and freedom visions since the beginning of time. But when those in power seek to control what is right, wrong, and acceptable, we're now having a conversation around the deeply embedded morals, traditions, and values that make up who we are and how we see one another. And while we think we're thinking for ourselves, men benefit from the conviction that it is all demise to not defend, protect, and desire them in every aspect of our lives. Now, I want people to pay attention to the response that they may have had, sitting here and listening to me name those things. That quiet response that only when you hear that any other kind of woman is wanting to, quote, take up space in a conversation about women as you acknowledge them. I want you to allow yourself to be uncomfortable in this kind of conversation. I want you to remember that place because it is a symptom of the patriarchal stronghold. We learn that a woman is a thing to be desired, consumable, and disposed of by men without consideration for our own humanities, and oftentimes to our detriment. Have you ever asked yourself what you think? Do you ever wonder what possibilities could be shaped without men's feelings, barriers, or needs in mind? Do you know how to celebrate yourself? Now, I want to make this clear, right? This isn't a man-bashing session. We don't need to do that in order to celebrate ourselves. But I do want us as women to acknowledge where our limitations come and what we imagine. Everything we imagine matters. We must fight for our imagination because we're living in a world that was imagined for us. Does that mean to stop loving men? No, not at all. Does it mean going home and telling off your dad and breaking up with your boyfriend as a radical feminist act? Nah, it doesn't. Does it mean you shouldn't be friends with men anymore? Absolutely not. It means something much greater for us as a village. It means challenging yourself to see that though you're surviving inside a system that named you powerless, that isn't the only gaze that matters. As women, we must always be mindful that we are in fact surviving patriarchy's impact all around us. And that our whole complex human outside of patriarchy's life. We were never supposed to know how powerful we are, but between the patterns of our histories and our present day objective reality, we learned and chose life from men. Do me a favor. I want every woman here in the room right now to take a second and reflect, think back over your life, your entire life, and ask yourself, how would the range of my imagination change if our lives were sustained outside of patriarchal binaries? Those things that keep us structured to respond in either or, man or woman, this or that, instead of both and then some. When will we start to think in possibilities? Multiple freedoms can exist at the same time, and we must be willing to open our vision to things beyond our understanding, beyond we know comfort, even within us. Nuance is where freedom lives, and to be a woman is the experience and affirmation of freedom's possibility. Here's what I mean by that. Women are shapeshifters. We fight for ourselves and every other living thing, even against our softness, our joy, our ease, oftentimes to our harm. Being a woman is to innately be a freedom fighter by position alone, a survivor still imagining, clinging to love's possibilities. We must remember ourselves beyond colonization's imprint. We must remember there were models, particularly in indigenous communities like on this land, where every person in a village, including women, had a powerful purpose. This is why we must separate ourselves from monolithic and hyper understandings of who and no one gets to police any woman. And as Jasmine Babineau states in her new poetry book, Ma's Words, prisons will never be home. Womanhood is not a thing to be surveilled, qualified, or policed. It is not a gender performance, sex object, or a style of dress. Being a woman is not a finite or definitive happening. It is an affirmation of a living culture so vast, we are still uncovering its depths. Toni Morrison gave a quote where she once said, "Definitions are for the definers, not the defined." I agree with that, and I definitely believe that many of you will too. This is why we celebrate. Throughout time and space, women have been thought leaders, change agents, and makers, all through strength. And I want to be clear that I don't mean strength limited to the size of your arms or the weight of your bench press, Although Serena Williams and Angela Bassett would still want to have a word, but strength like the amount of resistance you handle to survive. The world's limitations have never been women's problem, and though we are constantly given this world's second place medal, we are masters at creating pleasure through perseverance. My fiancé, Adrienne Marie Brown, once said, quote, "Pleasure is the point. Feeling good is not frivolous. It is freedom," end quote. True freedom cannot be known by those abusing power. When we begin to own our proximity to privilege and hardship simultaneously across all value and manner of being, it is only then this Women's History Month, I want to offer you a clean slate. This ain't no fragile offering, y'all, but one tangible enough to hold you, me, and every other woman on the planet in solidarity and gratitude for our lives, even against our differences. Octavia Butler teaches us, quote, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change." This was something that I learned as a little girl. Growing up, I would get the kind of language of tomboy. I preferred climbing trees over the traditional, what would be considered, Barbie dolls or the pink bows and all those. That was never really my thing, right? That's what I would call like an acceptable kind of aversion or adjacency to girlhood. It was something that was kind of acceptable. They were like, oh, she's just going through whatever phase. But it was never acceptable as I got older. There was a space of like, oh, there needs to be some structure to make sure she knows her position in society. This climbing trees, this like running, and this one to be an athlete and strong and all these, that's not desirable. She'll never find a husband. I was raised in the Pentecostal church, and that was one of the greatest limitations I had to overcome. Because instead of allowing me to be and rest into the womanhood I was blooming into, I was stuck within the rigidity of how hyper-feminine standards for womanhood were the ones that were supposed to shape my desirability for men. If I understood that God is change, I had to also understand that God was going to still love the version of me that I am. That rigidity was made by human beings, not so much by God themselves. That quote is one of my favorite quotes because no matter what we understand to be our truth, we are never the worst things we've ever done, and we are always worthy of being free. I was worthy of being free. Change is always available to us, and I invite you into change, which means I invite you to God. Not as a finite gendered being, but as all manner of possibility without limitation. I know we probably have our different things of what that is, but I imagine that if we understand God to be all powerful, all knowing, everywhere at once, we must also know that God's love is not measured solely by the distance of our feelings, nor governed by the limitations of how we understand humanity. It means sacrifice, love, community, or as Bell Hooks mentions in her book, All About Love, New Vision, love as the nurturance of one another's growth. I offer you the opportunity to recognize the power in your own womanhood without placing limitations on anyone else's, whether it be heterosexual women, trans women, queer women, masculine women like myself, non-binary women, fat women, disabled women, women of rich skin tones, athletes, women who aren't seen as conventionally attractive due to white heteronormative standards, gender creative women, and so many what I like to call who have no acknowledged naming but are practicing freedom. We celebrate women because of what we are, not because of what we lack in proximity to dominant patriarchal narratives. Womanhood is vastly complex and unlimited, and for the rest of my life, I will not return to limitation. I offer you room to imagine with me. My innate masculinity proved to me that masculinity was genderless, not that I needed to embrace a desire to be a man. Toni Morrison proved to us that stories could be told without centering white people. Octavia Butler taught us that we can see the future if we continue to imagine. Harriet Tubman taught us that freedom was non-negotiable and always possible. Oprah taught us that legendary journalism is best done by women. Simone Biles taught us that we could be the best Olympic and that it didn't need to be a man. Miriam Kaba teaches us that we don't need prisons because no human is disposable. And I'm here today to ask you, what will you teach us? What will the future of what you produce bring? Where will your magic plant seeds that grows for our children's future? We are ready to celebrate you. I want everyone in the room under the sound of my voice to remember your worthiness, to remember why you deserve being celebrated, to remember that it doesn't need external validation or acknowledgement for that worthiness to manifest as true. We're ready to celebrate you. Find your purpose, find your place, find your community. Make sure that we take care of one another as we navigate a world that was created without us in mind. We're ready to celebrate you. Thank you. Thank you so much for all your time. I would love to open up the floor now to speak with you. If people have questions, whether it be about the keynote, about queering masculinity, how we come to queering womanhood, how we come together as a community, as a village, and what it means to celebrate women. Where do we fit into those narratives? I would love to hear from you.
If we could use the hand raising function, and that'll just be easier for me to call on everybody. So. Well, I have a question. So,
don't be scared, John. I don't bite.
I have a question. So, I grew up a lot with all brothers. So like growing up, I got the hand-me-downs with my brothers, like whatever, So like I got that tomboy sometimes, and it never necessarily bothered me. And then I got older, got to college, and it's like, why don't you dress like the other girls? Blah blah blah. I'm learning to respond differently, but what are like some of the responses that you give people, or like you tell people that you don't want to sound like you're being defensive, but like you still defending yourself in the same space? So
when I hear people compare my womanhood to someone else's, I'm often curious to know what kind of woman they are. I'm often like, are you even talking about me in this conversation? Because I don't believe personally that there's just this experience that's collapsed into a monolith or some linear narrative. So my responses probably, when I was younger, probably were a lot more spicy than they would be now, if I'm honest. But I would say that I invite people to get to know my womanhood. I feel this way about my womanhood. I feel this way about my masculinity. It's like, you have to be willing to be uncomfortable to get to know me, because I'm not like anything you've ever known. So it's a choice, it's a choice to be accountable to their shaping and to their limitations to be able to engage with you. And I think that that's deeply important for me as a person as well. So keeping the people around me, like anyone that I have around me, means that I'm also going to be someone who sets that boundary. Like, I don't really want you to come over here with the limitations of how you you think I should be to that a woman is or should be, because that's you not being accountable to the limitations of how patriarchy has conditioned so many of us, all of us actually. See, we got a hand.
Elena?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Hi, Elena.
Thank you for being here. I was curious if you feel comfortable speaking to this. I also resonated with the background of growing up identifying as a tomboy, and I really appreciated my innate masculinity, proved that masculinity is genderless. I love that. And for the first time, I'm in a relationship where my partner and I both identify as genderqueer and simultaneously present hetero. And I'm curious, like, how you navigate in having a right relationship to change that space of like being welcome to change in your relationship and understanding like that journey of queerness is never ending. And you're constantly negotiating what that means and simultaneously negotiating that against like other people's projections onto your relationship of like hetero presentation and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for sharing, Elena, so vulnerably. I would say that's one of those boundary things too. You know, we are constantly grappling with this space of it overlaps with something else, then it's the same as that. So I hear people all the time say things like what you were just naming, which is, it's heterosexual to be or dress in this way or to act this way or to do this thing. And as queer people, I genuinely believe that there's more depth than the surface level. Oh, this person would be deemed acceptable or consumable or desirable by men in a particular capacity. Because I'm like, this person also is desirable by, women and other queer people. And it's like, where are the limitations with which we need to kind of remove this thing where we say, if you look like this, this must be your experience, or this must be how you are understanding or being shaped by the world. So how I navigate it myself is I don't allow the world to tell me about myself. So I take it up to, set the boundary. There is that kind of, duality for me where it's like, I understand who I am as it pertains to being inside a white heteronormative patriarchal system, and I know the experience of my complexity that may not be embodied by the limitation of this language or these experiences inside this gaze, but I do know for myself that outside of that, I'm a whole human experience with so much more depth and complexity than the space of like how I'm being seen by this person. So I think it's a learning process for all of us, because we are all just immersed in this stuff, and to be free means to question it or to remain curious around it. And it's like, how do we do that when we're still like also trying to validate ourselves in some way? I remember doing that with my masculinity. If I were to give you an example, I thought I had to, I had to walk around and have a little lean and like, talk like whatever. I thought I had to have a particular performance because I wanted people to externally view me as a particular thing. I thought I had to speak to women a particular way. I thought if I wore a bikini that I was like not as gay or whatever. It's like, no one gets to shape who you are but you. And no one gets to, like, this is why I love Toni Morrison saying definitions are for the definers, not the defined. So if it makes them feel good to be shaped by these limitations, that ain't your business. Like I said in the keynote, you know what I'm saying? I tell people all the time, like, I'm sorry to hear about your limitation. I'm sorry to hear about that, because it makes sense that we are all immersed in this, and I will be gentle with you. also set the boundary. I understand that this might overlap with this, and that makes you think you know my experience, like my masculinity. People perceive me and they're like, masculinity is inherently toxic, and this and that can't be reclaimed. And I'm like, I exist. I do not have male privilege or dominant power. You have to see something else. So you either are going to ask the questions necessary to be in right relationship with something that's nuanced, that you don't understand, to sit in that discomfort, or you cannot engage with me, period. So I hope that as an offer to you, that the affirmation of your life, your presentation, your love story is contingent upon the experience of your growth and the affirmation of your complexity and nuance, rather than how the world wants to consume you based on perception that is shaped by a dominant culture that we don't have control over. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, Elena. I think Jasmine has a question. She dropped it in the chat. If you want to speak that, or you want that to be read, Jasmine.
This question was from Clara. She is in the call right now, but she couldn't unmute herself. So her question is for you to answer, for parents or future parents, like how to navigate the toy aisle and all the things, and what should with children look like. She also saw the photo in the back of you, so that's why she was like, oh,
yes, and that's a funny story too, real quick. This is my godchild, and she is a little, I call her Smush, and she's the last baby I nannied. I was a nanny on and off for almost a decade, and like before COVID hit, and this is the last baby I nannied, and her parents asked me to be her godparent, and I said yes. So that is the story of the baby. I'm a very sweet child. As for I love talking about children specifically because I love children, obviously nanny for almost a decade. But, in raising children, I think the first step to, being mindful of things like gendered things, like the clothes or the toy aisle or whatever else, is to understand the role of the parent. The role of the parent is not to make a carbon copy of yourself. It is to facilitate space, a safe space to nurture a child's growth. And I believe that oftentimes we try not to kind of put our hands in too much to be like, oh, I'm gonna offer this toy to the child, but if they want this toy, then I'll get it. It's like, what would happen if you just put the child on the aisle to get the toy and then get to know the kind of toys that the child likes? So I think these heavily gendered toy things based on the binaries that are happening in the world and that are so prevalent, and I think it matters a lot that we engage with children in ways that allows them to make choices. And that's what's so difficult, because we are constantly socialized and conditioned to silence children or tell them they're too small or too young to understand, whether it be themselves, their bodies, things they like, all these things. It's like, no, they need to be shaped, is what you're trying to say. What you're trying to say is you want to have power over them. So, I would offer allowing room for the child to choose, whether that means bringing the child blue and pink toys or neither toy and just, getting any kind of colored toys. It's like, what does the child like? And how do we engage with what it means to allow them to have agency over what they like and what they love? So, what offer that as navigating the toy aisle, because the fact of the matter is none of the toys